So for the improvisatory space-time synchrony theme for Black History Month, and today, specifically, February 26th, 2022, I thought what I would do is take a look at and just do a general outline, a discussion of a general outline of some of the racially discriminatory acts of censorship that have been enacted in various states in 2020 and 2021, both preceding and following former fascist President Donald Trump's attempt to overturn the results of a legal election and his incitement of a white nationalist insurrection on January 6th, 2021. So the first part of the discussion or improvisation for this particular theme will be just taking a look at, and there'll be two. I have two disclaimers. First of all, there are a lot better sources for information regarding these censorship, these curriculum censorships, racially motivated curriculum censorships in the public school system. And now that we have charter schools, any school that, presumably that these apply to any school that is funded by the federal government or by the state government in which these laws are enacted. Many of these laws are state laws so far, and so don't fall under federal jurisdiction. But of course, if we have either Trump or a Trump avatar fascist elected in 2024, which looks very likely, since if you read the polls, now there's an indication that the majority of U.S. voting citizens are identifying with the Republican Party, and we've presented evidence of that and information regarding that. That psychological phenomenon on our pages, prior to this. So the two disclaimers are, there's better information than what I'm looking at here, but this I'm using the Wikipedia page because it's handy and it's short and it's small and it's easy to navigate, and the facts that I'm going to examine in light of these restrictions for the date February 26th, which will examine a number of historically significant facts and historically relevant occurrences that relate to African American history that occur on February 26th, according to whether they would be teachable in a public school under these new censorship laws. That page I have not fact checked. So what I'm presenting as facts on that page is largely because there were a lot of images, and that looks good when I do these kinds of improvisatory readings, as opposed to what I'm doing now, which is focusing on this one word Republican, which is relatively, visually uninteresting, although from a psychological point of view, that I'm sort of targeting it, in this image is somewhat interesting. And largely unconsciously, because as I ramble with this discussion and what I want to produce in this piece, viewers that have looked at these pieces before will notice that a lot of the attention I pay to specific words seems to be, unconscious or pre-conscious, or not entirely in sync with the verbalizations that I'm performing, but has in some respects a kind of unconscious life of its own. In any case, let's identify a few of the features of these censorship facts, right? Okay, so here's the obligatory introduction throughout the history of the United States, blah, 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 blah. All right, so these are the kind of things that get censored, and here's information regarding these censorship, these curriculum censorship laws that were introduced in 2021. So this term critical race theory, and we're not allowed to talk about sexism. So as the court erodes the precedent of Roe versus Wade and introduces a number of bills that make it possible to discriminate against individuals who are non-binary or identify in ways other than sort of classically conservative, gender dynamics, and find excuses, to allow this discrimination. Like for example, my religion says I can't, bake a cake for a lesbian or gay. If I were teaching, I don't know if I'm even allowed to say lesbian or gay now, but I'm saying it because I'm not in a classroom situation where one of these laws has been enacted. But if I say my religion doesn't allow me to bake a wedding cake for a lesbian or gay couple, even at the level of the Supreme Court, these decisions are being made that that I'm allowed to discriminate on this basis. Well, and also, it's weird because not only is this not a feature of any religion that I know of, from its inception, but it shouldn't make any difference if it were. I mean, if it's against your religion to provide non-discriminatory services, then it's really against your religion to be a part of our country, isn't it? So you should. Sorry, but using the logic that's so often used by conservatives, then you should go somewhere else and practice your religion, right? The Puritans did this and moved away from England. So if your religion explicitly provides instructions that are anti-democratic and discriminatory, and that do so in the name of a malevolent and intolerant deity, then that religion is what should fall under critical discussion and legal accountability, right? Rather than being protected by a provision that is somehow being altered and used to destroy and erode and make a joke, really, out of the very idea of human and civil rights that are so inherently part of the process of, if not the inception of the United States, the evolution of and development of the United States as a democracy. And the same thing applies, in instances of critical race theory, although I don't know that, religious arguments are particularly relevant in this area. But the terms that come up, and they're probably somewhere in this article, in formulating these censorship laws around critical race theory, and the concepts that come up are relatively, it's a relatively short list of them. And one of them is that any discourse or concept or method or methodology of teaching that involves discussion of an inherent and systemic racial bias in the United States is censorable. And if that's the case, then all instances of the civil rights movement and organizations such as the NAACP and all of the work that organizations like that do is censorable, because you wouldn't need a civil rights movement, and you wouldn't need an organization like the NAACP, and you wouldn't need to write about the souls of black folk if there weren't systemic racism, right? And then another term that comes up is anything that would make anyone uncomfortable, which is very ambiguous and murky and subjective, right? So, but this idea that white folks can't feel guilty for the racial past, no matter what role they've played in it, and or no matter how they've benefited from it, and it's okay to deny that you've benefited from it, but it's not okay to look at the historical facts, right? And so if you talk about all socially relevant historical understanding will be replaced by Horatio Alger mythologies of the role of the individual spirit in or individual will, the triumph of the individual will, I guess, using a figure from a Leni Riefenstahl cinematic title, can replace a historical and accurate analysis of the history of economy as it relates to categories of race, the history of social restrictions and segregation as it relates to the category of race and color and all of this. So I'll scroll down a little bit and look at some of the terms that I expect to find at the bottom. Okay, so this is the This is in 2020. Tennessee House Bill 580. So again, it refers to the kinds of censorship and restrictions outlined. And here are some numbers. Law prohibits 14 concepts surrounding race and gender discrimination, including the concept of systemic racism. Okay, so these are nice little things because they give you these bubbles. So systemic racism is here defined as institutional racism, also known as systemic racism, a form of racism that is embedded in the laws and regulation of a society or an organization. So if you can't teach this, then you can't teach anything about the civil rights movement, right? Which is all about changing laws, right? So if it wasn't systemic, then you wouldn't have a civil rights movement. So these were just disgruntled individuals, right? That had their toes stepped on and had wanted to change the world, for their own personal needs, right? It wasn't that a group of heroic social activists, struggled to change, unfair and human rights violating and civil rights violating laws in states for the good of humanity, right? So let's see what else we can look at. Okay. That's not really helping us. Well, let's do a separate search and see if we can, I know that this just loops us back to where we are. It doesn't tell us what the 14 concepts actually are. Well, that may be enough. So let's go on to the other page that I have and take a look at some of these events that have actually occurred on this date, February 26th, and see if they would be teachable now under these new censorship laws. So the first is Carter Woodson's celebration of Black History Week. Initially it was in sometime in the middle of February because of these the coincidence of these birthdays of Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass. And presumably, if it were formulated in the right way, one would still be able to celebrate this. All right, so let's look at this one. Ramona Hood, FedEx's first African-American CEO. So this is one that the censors would really like, right? Because it's positive and she's the first, and it doesn't as long as you don't focus on why it wasn't until 2020 that FedEx, hired its first African-American CEO, and you focus instead on the fact that this woman is really, as has been said before, a credit to her race, and somehow in this moment became worthy of becoming FedEx's first African-American CEO. You'd certainly be able to teach this one. Grammy Awards. This is 1985, February 26th. On this day at the Grammy Awards ceremony, African-American musicians won awards in several categories. Okay, you can certainly teach this one, and it's very celebratory. And as long as you don't focus on the absence of winners in the years that preceded 1985, you could certainly. 1870, February 26th, Black leader of the Union League lynched. Wyatt Outlaw. white outlaw black leader of the Union League in Alamance County, North Carolina. Lynched. So you can't talk about this because that not only not only makes people uncomfortable, but if you read more, I'm sure you'll find that the law didn't do much about it. Well, in fact, there's not much more here. So if you follow White Outlaw's biography on a separate Wikipedia page for that, it provides information regarding this this death, this murder, and it explains it with the following. I'll read it briefly. Outlaw's prominent activities on behalf of African Americans and I don't know how to pronounce this, Alamance, I think, or Alamance County, made him the target of the White Brotherhood of the Constitutional Union Guard, both local branches of the Ku Klux Klan. As a prominent Republican in Alamance County, Outlaw was appointed to the Graham Town Council by Governor Holden and soon became one of the three constables of the town, all three of whom were African Americans. On one occasion in 1869, white residents in the area who were incensed by the prospect of being policed by an all-African American constabulary organized a nighttime ride in Klan garb through the streets of Graham in an effort to frighten the African American constables. Outlaw and other constables opened fire on the night riders, but no injuries were sustained. Outlaw's aggressive response to the night riders may have inflamed the anger of Klan sympathizers. The night of February 26, 1870, a party of unidentified men rode into Graham, dragged Outlaw from his home, and hung him from an elm tree. In the courthouse square in Graham, in what is known as Sesquicentennial Park. Outlaw's body bore on the chest Outlaw's body Outlaw's body Outlaw's body bore on the chest a message from the perpetrators and then it says that this a local African-American man named Poise claimed to know who was responsible for the lynching, but Poise was soon found dead in a nearby pond. So I'm fairly certain that one would be censored for teaching any and all of this account. In 1873, Guilford County Superior Court Judge Albion Turgey advocated for revisiting the murder of Wyatt Outlaw. That year, the grand jury of Alamance or Alamance County brought federal indictments against 63 Klansmen, including 18 murder counts in connection with the lynching of Wyatt Outlaw. However, the Democratic-controlled state legislature, and it's very important because the Republican Party at this time is using a lot of misinformation regarding the history of the Republican Party as a force for racial justice, and that was only true for a period following the emancipation of African American slaves, and the social and philosophical dynamics of the Republican Party by the 1960s was basically an inversion or conceptually opposite image of what it began as, and although as late as Alabama, Governor, Wallace, certain branches of Southern Democrats, continued to run on platforms of segregation and racial separatism. But I need to point out now in this era of newspeak and Orwellian language manipulation that the Democratic-controlled Senate of 1873 was nothing like the Democratic Party today, and that the racial dynamics of the differences between Republicans and Democrats are shouldn't be confused any more than Hitler's fascist National Socialism should be associated with any kind of true democratic, socialism for the welfare of the general public, right? The Democratic-controlled state legislature repealed the laws under which most of these indictments had been brought. So the charges were dropped. No one was ever tried in connection with Outlaw's murder. And if that's not systemic racism, then I honestly don't know what is. So laws were changed in order for these murderers to escape trial and punishment. That's extraordinarily systemic and operatively and systematically, right, racially oppressive, or somehow they managed to slip through the legal system, which according to these censorship laws is not systemically racist. Singer Fats Domino was born. Okay, we could teach that. Cassius Clay becomes Muhammad Ali. Well, this one is an interesting one because you could certainly teach it, right? But there are limits to what you can teach about Muhammad Ali in relationship to this new law, because you certainly can't mention the fact that he was a member of the Black Muslims, right, and the Nation of Islam, and you can't talk about his relationship to the Nation of Islam, and you probably can't talk much about his protests of the Vietnam War. And you can use his name, but you can't talk much about why his name became Muhammad Ali. So I don't know. I don't know how you would talk about Cassius Clay, his name becoming Muhammad Ali, without talking about the Nation of Islam and racial justice and the injustice in the United States and the civil rights movement and the various manifestations of the civil rights movement and how all of these things get played out in the sports arena, without talking about systemic racism. So I very much doubt that you could talk about that. Race riot, Columbia, Tennessee. Race riot, Columbia, Tennessee. 2 killed and 10 wounded. So the story of the Columbia race riot of 1946 is fairly complicated, but almost on every level, the narrative demonstrates the fact that both the police and the judicial system systematically supported the violence of and racially discriminatory and civil rights violating agenda of local white business people and local white residents over the rights of African Americans systematically. And it begins with this narrative. The story begins with an incident in a local store in which an African American family, a World War II veteran and his mother, brought to a local department store a radio which had broken and needed repair. And when they returned to pay for the cost of the repair, and to recover the radio, they discovered that it had been stolen by either a store employee or the store management, and sold to another family, to a white family. So that they stole the radio and sold it, and rather than rectifying the theft or error, if one wanted to be overly and unduly and unduly willing to allow that the sale of this particular item wasn't motivated by racial hatred and intolerance, which I'm not willing to put much stock in such an interpretation. But even had it been an error, the response made to the family attempting to recover their property was that the store employee began to verbally abuse the mother, and in the process of this assault, this verbal assault, the son, began fighting with the store employee, and at least this is what is alleged. This may or may not be, the details of what actually happened, but maybe part of the historical record and testimony, because the record mostly includes only really, the white witnesses were allowed to present their sides of the story in this in the judicial documents that belong to these cases. So anyway, the accusation is that he threw him through a window and injured him. Then both the young man, or the man, and the mother were charged and arrested for disturbing the peace. They pleaded guilty and received a $50 fine. Now, no mention is made of the property that was stolen, but obviously neither the store nor the employees nor the store owner were brought to trial for the theft of the property, and the property was never returned. So we don't know the value of the radio, but that theft was not prosecuted, right, by under the conditions of the law, and one presumably can ascribe the rationale for that to systemic racism. All right, so in addition to all of that, there was a threat made on the part of a white mob following this incident that concerned the entirety of the black townspeople, and they armed themselves and prepared for what's often referred to as the backlash, the white racist backlash following this incident. And in the process of preparing for an assault of white mob violence, they they took out the lights in the town, shut out the lights, and at that point, then the Columbia police were brought in and attempted, presumably to make further arrests for the destruction of the town's property. And in the process of entering the community and the neighborhood, they were blockaded, and there was a shooting. There's no record of African American citizens who were shot by the police. Only a record of those white officers who received injury in this gunfire, two-way gunfire, and following the shooting, another attempt was made on the part of the police to terrorize the community, and in this attempt, the officers indiscriminately fired into homes and buildings. Innocent women and children were fired upon by the officers, and the entire community was terrorized by the police. And this all resulted basically from an attempt of a community of African Americans to protect themselves against the violence that was mounting from a white mob. Individuals were arrested, their property was confiscated, and more than 100 African Americans were arrested within the community, and it's very unlikely that there were more than 100 individuals defending the community with guns and rifles. So the indiscriminate justice, is a result of the systemic racial apparatus as well. Three black men were singled out, as being responsible, and then in the course of their arrest, there was another scuffle, and probably fearing for their lives, at least these individuals, were accused of shooting, at these officers. But in the course of the scuffle, they were killed by the police, murdered probably, in all likelihood, and at that point, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, the organization we've been following and discussing a bit over the last couple of days, came to the defense of the remainder of those individuals who were, almost entirely certainly innocent of any acts of violence, and were still being held by the local police. Finally, 25 African Americans from Columbia were tried on these charges of shooting at the police officers, even though it's very unlikely that number of individuals were even carrying weapons. On October 4th, I'll just quote this, 1946, an all-white jury surprisingly found only 2 of the 25 blacks guilty, and the charges were later dropped. I'm not sure of the language here, but in all likelihood, the police had initiated the gunfight, and if any bullets at all were returned, it was a matter of self-protection under the rights of the law, and the fact that the charges were dropped later was probably a result of the presence of the NAACP and the possibility of investigating the deaths of Johnson and Gordon, the two individuals that were murdered by the patrolman, and what result might have become of making that a national incident, and drawing attention to the fact that the riot ensued from the violence initiated by the community, the white community, and the support of the police department in that particular incident. So that's, briefly an outline of this particular incident, and I think from that outline it becomes fairly obvious that the Columbia Race Riot of 1946 is not something that that can be taught in school at this time in these particular states that have initiated these censorship laws. You can't teach this one. Conference in the Wormley Hotel. At a conference in the Wormley Hotel in Washington, representatives of Rutherford B. Hayes and representatives of the South negotiated agreement, which paved the way for the election of Hayes as president. framed in the right way, I'm sure you can talk about this. Uh-oh. Here it is. Okay, so the same, you know, obviously, the transformation of Cassius Clay into Muhammad Ali on February 26, 1964, just a few months before I was born, the same rationale for censoring that fact would be a rationale for censoring this fact, the birth of Wallace Fard Muhammad on February 26th, 1877. Wallace D. Fard, aka Wallace Fard Muhammad, was the co-founder of the Nation of Islam. He arrived in Detroit in 1930 with an obscure background, etc., etc. And the Nation of Islam, under his initial leadership, became, you know, a force of active social justice in the United States to be reckoned with. February 26, 1999, Camp Atwater. Camp Atwater is a cultural education and recreational camp designed for the children of African American professionals. The camp was founded in 1921 by Dr. William D. Berry, located in North Brookfield, Massachusetts. This we can talk about, unless it's too sexually provocative, and some of those other discrimination, censorship laws would prohibit. We might not be able to use this picture. We could probably talk about it, but we might not be able to use this picture. Theodore Flowers, middleweight boxing champion. Theodore Georgia Deacon Flowers wins middleweight boxing title in February 26, 1926. We can talk about this. Actor, comedian Godfrey Cambridge was born on February 26, 1933. We can talk about this. This is the same Carter Woodson fact that we read above. I'm not sure why it appears twice. Maybe to fill the page, although this kind of scrolling page is full when it's full, so I'm not exactly sure. The Green Pastures opened at Mansfield Theater. Now, I'm not sure because I don't know this play, and I don't know if this play has any political content. And these links, you know, don't seem to take us, you know, very far. These read mores, at least the first one that we opened onto, didn't tell us anything. No, same thing. It says loading, but the other one didn't load. We're not sure about that one. We're not sure about the Green Pastures. If the Green Pastures lacks, you know, all political content, then we'd be able to teach it in school. But if it's anything like, say it's like something like an, you know, Ishmael Reed play, well, you know, then we're not going to be able to teach that in school, right? Obviously. Okay. Andrew Brimmer becomes the first African-American governor of the Federal Reserve Board when he is appointed by President Lyndon B. Johnson. I'm sure this is just the kind of fact that we like to teach within these self-congratulatory models of what it means to be African American in the free states of the U.S. Congressman James O'Hara born, birthday of Congressman James E. O'Hara of North Carolina, first elected March 4, 1833. O'Hara served 2 terms, the second ending March 3rd, 1887. as long as you didn't, get too into what the political issues and agendas of the congressman were at the time, you could certainly teach that. The 15th Amendment guaranteeing the right to vote, probably one of the most important historical events in African American history here in the United States, and swiftly being eroded, not only by various states that have tried to repress and suppress voting rights in order to maintain Republican majority in the Senate and the state governments across the states, but also is being eroded and threatened in various ways now in the Supreme Court as well. At this time, I'm sure that it would be difficult for these laws to formulate a way that this central fact of the history of the United States government couldn't be taught in the school. However, if it's overturned, which once I think most of us would have thought would have been unfathomable and unimaginable, but even if it's not literally overturned, it could be effectively overturned. So speaking of it and the provisions that it makes for voting rights for male African American citizens of age, and made in 1869, talking about the way that those rights are being eroded currently in a variety of ways by acts of state legislation and supporting legal decisions in both at both the state level and apparently now at the federal level at the Supreme Court as well, could easily be restricted by these laws. So you can teach it, but you can't teach anything relevant to the present regarding this amendment. Camp Atwater, we talked about that. Jimmy Lee Jackson dies February 26, 1965. Civil rights activist died of injuries reportedly inflicted by officers in Marion, Alabama. So there's a variety of reasons. This one, would have to be excluded from the agenda, right? First, it's going to make all the white folks uncomfortable, and then and secondly, it obviously has everything to do with systemic racism and systemic injustice, or you wouldn't have, as I said, you wouldn't have a civil rights movement. And then it points to the fact that this individual struggling against these injustices was killed, and he was killed by officers. So the narrative of the murder of Jimmy Lee Jackson. This is a photograph of him from the Wikipedia page, that discusses that incident. It is just about the best example of systemic racism that one could imagine, and it is so not only because of the event itself and the brutality of the police and their attack on innocent African American civil rights protesters, but also because of the events leading up to Jackson's activism as a civil rights demonstrator and participant, and also the aftermath of the events of this killing itself, which also involved a number of demonstrations and marches, including the famous march on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and the events of Bloody Sunday, which was also a violent police assault on illegal and necessary protest of police violence. So we can begin, with a discussion of what led Jackson to become involved in civil rights to begin with, which was the fact that he was denied voting rights and had unsuccessfully attempted to register to vote several times, but because of laws enacted in the 20th century in Alabama at that time, it was very easy to find ways of discriminating under these laws, and to refuse African Americans the right to vote. And we have laws being enacted today that very much do the same thing, and that's why many of us are very much involved in protesting, petitioning, and fighting against those laws to the best of our ability in any and all ways that we can. So this form of discrimination, the suppression of his right to vote and to register to vote, had been an ongoing issue for, it claims here, 4 years, and that inspired him to join the civil rights movement, and particularly the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which led by C.T. Vivian was engaged in an activist protest against the imprisonment of another civil rights representative and leader named James Orange, who was being held in a jail for his work as a participant in the civil rights movement. And so this was supposed to be and C.T. Vivian has at least one page, of his own, dedicated to him on our YouTube platform. So it would be, and he's, left us within the last few years, couple of years, and it was his, departing that, inspired a page of honor, among the leaders and protesters of systemic injustice in the United States on our pages. That it was his passing that inspired us to honor him as one of those leaders on our pages. So this was to be, a peaceful protest and demonstration and song and gathering was to be performed, and of course it was met with resistance and violence by Marion police officers, and later, they claimed that they were threatened by the violence of this mob, when in fact that wasn't true at all. And but that's usually generally the way that these things work when African Americans are murdered by white racists, whether they're police or not, then later the justification there will always be a claim that the white folks were threatened by these individuals. So in the course of the police assault, and I'll read this section because this is the section that details Mr. Jackson's death. Jackson, his sister, his mother Viola Jackson, and his 82-year-old grandfather Cager Lee ran into Mac's Cafe behind the church, pursued by state troopers. Now remember, this is an assault, of state troopers on a peaceful protest inspired by the peaceful, nonviolent style protests of Martin Luther King Jr. and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, who never advocated for forceful or armed conflict. Police clubbed Lee to the floor in the kitchen. When Viola attempted to pull the police off, she was also beaten. Then Jackson tried to protect his mother. One trooper threw him against a cigarette machine. A second trooper shot Jackson twice in the abdomen. So he's attempting to protect his family, and he's further assaulted and then shot, even though he's not armed. None of these individuals are armed, and shot twice. And then this is a later history. It wasn't until 2005 that the trooper associated James Bernard Fowler. He may appear in another one of our historical presentations and videos. I'm not sure if I've made one. We've done a lot of work around civil rights issues. Was publicly associated with the shooting. In an interview with him in the Anniston Star, he admitted the shooting, saying it was self-defense. Okay, so I had just mentioned that, right? It's always self-defense when a white racist, kills a person of color, right? Even if the person of color is unarmed or whatever, as he thought Jackson was going for his gun. Well, I mean, Jackson didn't have a gun, and none of the members of the protest in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference did, because they were all led by C.T. Vivian, who was another proponent of nonviolence based upon, Martin Luther King Jr.'s and Mahatma Gandhi's model. But whatever. And okay, I lost my place. Okay, so that's the excuse. The wounded Jackson left the cafe suffering additional blows by the police. So even after he's being shot, he's still being assaulted by the police. And then he told this to witnesses, including the FBI, and before his death, Jackson was served with an arrest warrant. Okay, so as insult to injury, after being attacked, his family attacked in a peaceful protest, after being shot twice, and then beaten after being shot, then to cover, I guess, all this up, then the police department, and again, example of systematic racism, comes up with a warrant for his arrest, and this apparently was issued by Colonel Al Lingo, head of the Alabama State Police. Some of this information is, if not new to me, at least not readily available in my memory files. The Alabama State Senate responded to national criticism and formally denounced charges of dereliction by Lingo's troopers in Marion. So this is another important thing in establishing the centrality of the systemic nature of this racism, right? The Alabama State Senate responded to all of these incidents by making a national statement and formally denouncing charges of dereliction by Lingo's troopers in Marion. So saying that they did nothing wrong. So all of this is being justified not only at the level of the local police departments, but by the state Senate, the Alabama State Senate, right? That's systemic. That is part of the system, right? So, and then it goes on and talks a little bit about that, and then of course, these events, if you and they're documented here. I won't talk about all of them, but were such an outrage that they inspired a number of marches following these events, like as I mentioned, the march and the violence perpetrated again by the police on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, Bloody Sunday, for which John Lewis who also passed from us within the last couple of years, is well known as the sort of heroic leader of the non-violent movement across the Edmund Pettus Bridge that resulted in both his assault by police and the assault of many other protesters that made such violent incidents part of the national agenda, and so also belongs to the list of honorable and heroic individuals who made such grave sacrifices for our freedoms. And in any case, the incident was recognized by Martin Luther King Jr., and this is a statement that he made. Jimmy Lee Jackson's death says to us that we must work passionately and unrelentingly to make the American dream a reality. His death must prove that unmerited suffering does not go unredeemed. We must not be bitter, and we must not harbor ideas of retaliating with violence. So again, underscoring and emphasizing, the nonviolent approach that that individuals like C.T. Vivian and John Lewis and Malcolm X, all had proposed and worked within, and that were part of the procedural or operational, ideology that belonged, to this incident in which Jimmy Lee Jackson was murdered. So murdered by violent forces of oppression in the act of peaceful protest, and the fact that that Martin Luther King Jr. can underscore and point to the principles of nonviolent protest, again, while commenting on Jackson's heroism is quite moving and profound. Particularly the final statement in that quote: "We must not lose faith. We must not lose faith in our white brothers," which is so difficult a thing not to do, right? All of that being said, and of course, obviously the story is much more complicated than I've laid it out here, and I'm doing so in a very cursory way and trying to condense everything into what will be a presentable piece and not exceed much more than an hour. But quite obviously, this is yet another example of a currently unteachable moment under these acts of educational censorships. Robert Williams' birthday. Robert Williams in full Robert Franklin Williams. Was born in 1925. Well, as far as I know, the story of the life of Robert F. Williams has never been a part of the public school curriculum.
And even, before the enactment of these laws censoring teachers' ability to talk about civil rights and critical race theory, and defining a belief in the fact of the systemic racial injustice in the United States as being not suitable for being part of the curriculum. And there are a number of reasons, why the life of Robert F. Williams is probably not part of the U.S. educational curriculum, at least in the broader scope of schools in the United States, and some of those reasons are available in the very first section and 3 paragraphs of the Wikipedia article. And they're referenced here. So the first is the kissing case, which story is a model of systemic racism, and let's see if some of the other ones are whether his harassment is listed. No, we'll find that later. Williams wasn't an advocate of nonviolent civil protest for the reason that he and his family had been threatened under in a number of different instances by the violence of the KKK and the violence of local police and the refusal of court systems and other forms of justice that one should have access to respond to those acts of violence against him and his family. And in fact, the institutional and systemic nature of the perpetrated violence exceeded even the justice system, the legislative system, and the police force, and was also underscored by the fact that that he lost his insurance for his car, and it was justified as a result of these violent actions performed against him, and we'll get to that. But he's the author of the famous volume Negroes with Guns, which I used to have a copy of in my library, but as I've mentioned in a number of these discussions, my library has suffered a number of losses, one of which was largely terminal, and we had to begin a new library entirely. But this volume was inspirational for both members of the Black Panther Party and others who had a different model of resistance than that promoted by Martin Luther King Jr. and the non-violent civil rights movement that we've been talking about. So let's go to maybe this one first, the kissing case, and talk about the way that it exemplifies what we mean when we say systemic racial injustice. Okay, so the kissing case involves the fact that in 1958, when these incidents occurred, Williams was a principal member of his local branch of the NAACP, and as such defended two boys. I believe they were ages 7 and 9, but I'm not sure. They were African-American boys, let's just say 7 and 9, or around that age, and they weren't even accused of anything, but a white girl had kissed each of them on the cheek, and I guess bragged about it to her mother. And her mother was, obviously, racist, and was incensed by this act, and wanted justice brought, against these boys, and in fact, it was, and they were arrested, and they were beaten, and they were placed in prison, and later, I think I'll look, and see what the site says, but I believe that they were absolved or pardoned by the governor or someone. We'll look at it, but here's an example of the way that this incident would have played out if racism weren't a systemic aspect of the United States judicial and law enforcement system, right? Okay, so the mom is mad and she calls the police, and the police come out and say, "Sorry, ma'am, here in the United States you have a right to be racist, but there's nothing that we can do about your intolerance, and as far as we can see, your daughter is the one responsible for kissing these boys, and if you don't want her to kiss African American young men, then you should tell her not to." And that would be the end of it. But no, instead, because the nature of racism in America is systemic, the result was, and let's go down and see if we can find it. The result was in 1958, Williams, as head of the NAACP chapter, defended two young black boys, ages 7 and 9, so I was right about the ages, who were jailed and beaten in Monroe after white girl kissed each of them on the cheek and told her mother, who became enraged, la la la, we've already narrated all of this. And I want to find out who... Okay, so the reason that the charges were dismissed was because it became, global news, right? And it became known around the world, and it made us look bad, basically. Like they would probably have remained in jail 7 and 9 years old had it not been brought to public attention, right? That's why it was dismissed, not because there's systemic justice in the United States, right? Okay, so they were pardoned by the governor of Northern Carolina, and why? Again, because it made the global press. But in fact, the state never apologized for its treatment of them. Okay, so that's one example of an incident in the life of Williams that illustrates systemic racism and the way that it works, as opposed to what it would look like if racism weren't systemic, right? Okay, so here's another example. This is one I was talking about, harassment. Okay, so the Nationwide insurance company canceled his collision and comprehensive car insurance, and the justification was not that he was a member of the NAACP, right? Okay, so they claim that it wasn't that he was a member of the NAACP that caused him to cancel his car insurance, but the fact that rocks had been thrown at his car and home several times by people driving by his home at night. These incidents had just forced us to get off the comprehensive and collision portions of the policy. Okay, so this is like saying this. So we're not racist, right? We're not canceling the policy because we're racist. We're canceling the policy because there are racists out there that are destroying his property, and then that would cost us a lot of money. So rather than like sending out an investigative agent and finding out like who is responsible for the damage, right, and then prosecuting them, then we're just going to cancel the policy, right? Can you imagine? You can't even imagine this being an excuse had Williams not been black, or had Williams been white, rather, because you can imagine the same treatment had he been Native American, had he been Mexican American, or had he been Asian. But you can't imagine if he had been white, saying that, oh well, black folks keep throwing rocks at your car, and so we're gonna cancel your policy. And then to make matters triply worse, so. Here's another part of the story that I had not remembered. The Raleigh Eagle reported that Williams had said that 6 months before, a 50-car Ku Klux Klan caravan had swapped gunfire with a group of blacks outside the home of Albert E. Perry, vice president of the local NAACP chapter. The article quoted Police Chief A.A. Maury as denying part of that story. He said, "I know there were no shootings." Okay, so National Insurance Company says they can't cover the car because people are throwing rocks at it. And then the implication is that they're racist and they don't like this member of the NAACP, but there's nothing they can do about it. And then the local police department say about the same vehicle, right, probably, well, it's not the Ku Klux Klan's fault, right? Because we know that these things have happened, William insisted, but the police chief says, "I know there was no shooting," right? So he said that he had several police, gotta find my place, cars accompanying the KK caravan to watch for possible law violations. Okay, so the excuse is, right? Okay, so the cops come out and they're gonna follow the cops, the police, the local police, following the KKK caravan, right? That inflicted damage and that were shooting, right, at members of the NAACP, and ostensibly the police say that they're accompanying them, right, to watch for possible law violations. But what it turns out is they're following them to become witnesses that they don't do these things, when in fact they do these things, right? The police are there to perform, right, as the false witnesses for the actions of the KKK. And if that's not systemic racial injustice, how would you define systemic racial injustice, right? Okay, so did we read this other part up here? I don't think we did. We never got to it. Okay, so in his stance and interpretation of civil rights protest and his endorsement of armed self-defense and armed civil protest, he became a member of the National Rifle Association, supported freedom riders, and integration, and also a variety of different forms of marches and types of protests. Okay, so as a result of that and that particular stance, again, and Ronald Reagan was the same way. When African Americans start arming themselves with guns, white folks get nervous, right? Okay, so all the white folks are nervous, including the FBI, even though the individuals associated with his group haven't committed any act of violence whatsoever, and have only been the recipients of violence, both on the level of private citizenry, the KKK members, and their support by local police, and extended into court systems as well. Okay, so in 1961, he and his wife left the United States for several years to avoid kidnapping charges. Okay, so apparently this woman was paid by the FBI to claim that Williams and his wife kidnapped her. And this was an excuse to put him on trial, right? Because why? Because he was, radical black activist in the 50s and 60s, right? And okay, so they had to flee the country. So they fled the country, and this woman was willing to testify against him to this fact. He fled the country. The local FBI and the local police and the FBI allegedly convinced the couple. So later it comes out that the local police and the FBI conspired against Williams and used this woman, convinced this woman to say that Williams had, this couple, I guess there was another one. Maybe there was more than one woman. I'm not sure what's going on with that. Anyway, that Williams had either kidnapped her or them, and then the FBI put out a warrant for his arrest. Okay, so there's like conspiracy on that level. So conspiracy between local police and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. How non-systemic is that, right? Okay. It's impossible to imagine anything more systemic and organized than that, particular example of racial bias and assault and conspiracy than what we're describing here, causing him to flee to Cuba and the later People's Republic of China, and then so as finally, these charges were dropped by the state when Williams returned for his trial, right, in 1975, following his return in 1970. So do you really think that the charges would have been dropped against this individual, had there been any grounds whatsoever for pursuing them? Well, obviously not. And again, an example of facts and details that there's not even any argument about it. It's completely systemically racist from top to bottom. I mean, how much further up do you have to go, right? Who does the FBI, report to? Okay, so on all levels of government, on local levels, on federal levels, on state levels, the narrative of the life of Robert Franklin Williams is a story of systemic racial injustice in the United States, and can only be viewed and regarded as such, and so it's appropriate, that we end there.